Well, Kevin, thank you so much for coming on the show, dude. It's been forever since I've seen you. I think last time I saw you was Sayoc Sama Sama LA, I think.
It
I
might
think
have
that's
been
the one.
2014, which that is a decade ago, and a lot has changed since then. And it's
Yeah,
been way
man.
too long. But I think a pandemic got in the way there for a while,
Yeah.
and maybe a few little ones for you. So we'll uh,
Yeah.
we'll catch up on here, I'm sure.
No, 100%, man, 100%. So again, this podcast, before I start, actually, I want to be very transparent. So I wasn't intending to do a podcast or anything like that, like this, but over the summer when my wife and I were visiting our family in New Jersey, I said, "Oh, Kevin Estela, he actually has this interview with his dad, and I want to
Mm.
listen to it." And so my wife and I were driving the car, and the entire time, we were just like locked into this interview. Like she loved it, I loved it, and it really is the catalyst for this. So I want to say thank you first of all for inspiring
Oh,
me to do this. If it wasn't for that, I don't think I'd be doing this.
well,
To
that's
hear,
fantastic.
yeah, I
Yeah,
appreciate you,
that,
man. Thank you so much for that.
oh, my pleasure. And that podcast that I do with my father, it was one that I didn't tell him we were going to publish it. I just wanted to have a conversation with my dad.
Sure,
I just wanted to interview it. My dad is 85. He's a little hard of hearing, so I
yeah,
was worried at a point or two in that podcast that he wasn't going to hear the questions correctly. But he was sitting at the beach in his car. He had the windows up, and he just got into it, and it came out great. And I've had a lot of good feedback about it. And I think it's important to have a discussion with your father and kind of get that information and just have that record of you talking to your dad and things that you talked about, because it's so important to remember those lessons as we grow older.
100%, 100%. And like, what really gripped me about that particular episode is just the relationship you have with him.
Mm.
And admittedly, in the Filipino American community, there's a lot of sons. I'm very fortunate that my relationship with my father's improved. It wasn't that it was bad, but there's a distance. A lot of times I noticed there's a lot of fathers, Filipino dads who are like, I'm here and you're there. And it's this
Yeah,
very, but it seems there's a real true connection, a friendship that you have with your dad. And it seems that it started at a very young age. So for those, I'm pretty sure everyone watching this knows who you are. You're very well known. You're now basically internationally known. I knew you back in the day. You were, teaching your survival stuff, and
mm,
people knew who you were then. You were writing articles in magazines. You were at, Sayoc Kali events, and it was fantastic. And now seeing you on this global scale, you're on all these different podcasts. You're very well known now. But I know there might be people on this podcast who don't know who you are. So do you mind just going into your origin story, where you're from, who you are, and what you do?
absolutely, absolutely. So I grew up in New England. I grew up in Connecticut, and I'm the youngest of three kids. Great family, and I can say that from the bottom of my heart that, like, I grew up in an awesome family that was super supportive. We had fun together. The things were good, right? So I'll never say that my family was one that experienced hardship at a young age. Like, life was good when I was younger. I grew up in the 80s, which was a great generation to grow up with. Growing up with
Sure.
He-Man and G.I. Joe and Rambo and all that. And my father was a physician. He just retired after 58 plus years of being a physician. And that's the life that I grew up in, where, my dad's a doctor, and every chance that he could get when he wasn't on call, we would go hiking, or we would go and explore in the backyard. He would build me cool stuff, like, because he wanted to be an architect. So he would draw me pictures of what he experienced in the Philippines. And that is part of my story, was his story, because as a little kid, I learned a lot about my father's struggles growing up in the Japanese occupied Philippines when Japan invaded the Philippines during World War II. And my dad grew up in a cave. And I was like, whoa, hold on, Dad, you grew up in a cave. Tell me more about that. And that was the catalyst for me wanting to learn about, how do you trap animals? Tell me about your Crossman air rifle that you talk about. Tell me about fishing and all this stuff. So as a little kid, we would go hiking, and I wanted to just constantly grow that knowledge base, because I was like, this is what my dad did. I looked up to my dad, and I want to do what my dad did. Bottom line. So we would go fishing, and he took me to get my hunter safety course. And I grew up a sportsman. I grew up hunting, fishing, camping, hiking, and mountain biking with friends. So I grew up in New England, was lifelong outdoorsman. And at some point I was like, I need to formalize my outdoor education. That's when I started taking kayaking lessons and going to the Maine Primitive Skills School and Jack Mountain Bushcraft, and eventually learning a lot of what I know now from Marty Simon, who was my late mentor at the Wilderness Learning Center. And the whole while, I'm also straddling the life of a public school high school history teacher. And
Mhm.
and people forget that about me. They're like, you were a history teacher? I'm like, yeah, for 14 years. So I would teach at the history level. I would teach history at the high school level. And anytime that I had free, I was teaching for the Wilderness Learning Center or doing my own thing. As you mentioned, writing magazine articles. And that really was the next evolution of my life, which was going from educator and bushcraft and survival student and instructor to a writer. And eventually I said, well, I am so comfortable in the great outdoors, but I never felt comfortable as a teacher, in the schools saying, well, if a fight broke out, how would I restrain students without hurting them? And I was like,
Mm,
I need to study martial arts again because as a kid, I did that.
mm,
So that's when I was like, well, I'm Filipino. I might as well learn Filipino martial arts.
right.
And I look up, I'm like, well, where's this? I remember seeing Filipino martial arts in this movie called The Hunted. And I'm like, what Filipino martial art was that? And then it said Sayoc Kali. And I was like, okay, let me see where there's a Sayoc Kali school. I bet there's not one in Connecticut. Well, there happened to be one in my hometown, in the same town that I'm teaching high school history in. So I go down there
Legit.
and I was like, hey, I'm interested in Filipino martial arts. I meet Manong Rich and Manang Su. At the time, they were Guru Rich and Guru Su. And I start training in Filipino martial arts. And then eventually that pathway and the tutelage from Pamana Tuhan, that led me to write my book, which led me to greater exposure, as you mentioned, which led me to an opportunity to leave teaching at the high school for teaching full-time survival skills and tactics and whatnot, and firearms and whatnot to a larger audience through fieldcraft survival. And that's where I am today. I'm the director of survival, sometimes director of training, but always an outdoorsman, always bringing that perspective to the classes that I teach. And it gives me an opportunity to podcast, to blog, to do some pretty exciting things and share knowledge that at the end of the day, I'm happy because it levels up people and gives them power. And that is so important.
100%. And so thank you for sharing all of that. And, hearing not just about your story with your dad and how he brought you to where you are today, I kind of want to backtrack a little bit and talk about your father. For
Absolutely.
those of you who have not for those of you who do not know about his dad has a really cool story. You kind of mentioned it, be
Yeah.
living in a cave. When I heard about this, and not just hearing your dad's interview, but also hearing about this from you back in the day, it just enamored me. And he has such an amazing story. So could you go back and talk about your father's background just
Oh yeah.
a little bit of
Yeah.
a bio on him, just because there should be a movie about him. I feel there needs to be a
I
Hollywood movie about
completely
your dad.
agree. I
It's so
completely
epic.
agree. And
It's
I
so
wish
epic.
that movie could have been made 20 years ago, because I think my father would have wanted Sean Connery to play him,
Yeah.
since my dad's a huge Dr. No fan. So
Yeah.
my father was born January 4th, 1939, and he was born in the Philippines. He was born to Don Gregorio Estela, and my grandmother was my Lola, and they were a very well-to-do Spanish Filipino family. And my father grew up a mestizo. My grandfather, I never knew him, but I was told that he was a very large man, a very prominent man, and he used to do a lot of fun things like bend nails in hardware stores to show off how strong he was. Typical Filipino macho stuff, right?
Yeah.
So my dad grew up. He grew up I believe he was the third in line out of four brothers. He had a younger brother and two older brothers, David and Vincent, and then his younger brother was Manuel. And he grew up in the Philippines. My grandfather was very prominent, very outspoken. And when Japan invaded, my grandfather, he became a target of the Japanese because he was so outspoken, and because if someone were to speak out against the Japanese Imperial Army, well, and if they were to be a supporter of the United States, then clearly that army was very vicious with how they went after people. And my grandfather was like, that's not happening to my family. And he moved the family and many members of the town into the jungle, and they lived there from roughly January 1942 until August of 45. And those are approximate dates because I know the Imperial Army invaded in 42, and I know that the war ended effectively, in 45, August 45. So they lived in a cave. They had very limited interaction with the town, and they had to just do things the way that you can imagine a family on their own would have to do them. A lot at night, very discreet and very, very secretive, because they were always under the threat that they would be captured. They would be considered threats against the Japanese Imperial Army, since they betrayed orders and they weren't round up like everyone else. And that's how they lived. And shortly after the war, when the families returned from the jungle to the town, they saw everything was destroyed. As you can imagine, in a war-torn country, things that you valued disappeared, destroyed. Anything that had water in it was used as a bathroom. I mean, you can imagine the trauma of experiencing what it's like, not just knowing that someone broke into your home, but someone was living in your home. People were not respecting your place and treating it like a latrine, treating it, as anything but the home of a loving family. Mm-hmm. So my father, shortly after the war, life has to go back to normal. And since the family lost so much in the war, what they still had was the land. And they started selling off the land in order to put the older brothers through school, put my father through school, and so forth. And my father grew up going to Santo Tomas, and he went to military schools, and he became very disciplined. I mean, to this day, he still values physical training. He jogs in place every morning and does push-ups and lifts dumbbells. So he believes in that because that was instilled in him at a very young age. My father went through medical school in the Philippines, and he had an opportunity to either, live in the Philippines and to continue, studying out there, leveling up, or come to America. And the interesting connection is that when my father was an intern in the Philippines, my father interned for Dr. Sayoc, which was Pamanatuhan's grandfather. And I didn't realize this until 2011, 2012, when my father came down to Raisu Martial Arts. I'm sorry, this was 2013. Until my father came down to Raisu Martial Arts and met Manatuan for Sayoc. He said, Sayoc. And he pronounced it Sayoc. He goes, I interned for a doctor named Sayoc. And then he grabbed Manatuhan by the arm and he's like tugging at him. He goes, I know your grandfather. And he said, my brother and your father were best friends in Manila. Your father used to leave the door open to the car when they would go into a restaurant, kind of like, go ahead and touch my car, and they bonded. Wow. And then the most amazing thing happened. And, I had this memory, the collective memory, a memory that makes you smile. Pamanatuhan grabbed my father's hand, because my father is older than Pamanatuhan, and he monopoed my father. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I've been monopoling Tuhans in this system, and I just watched Pamanatuhan do it to my dad.
Wow.
And then, he told me, he's like, well, your father is an elder. Your father is someone who, my father and your grandfather, like we're all connected. So even though like I haven't been consistent with my training because of moving from Utah to North Carolina and injuries and whatnot and the pandemic, I always will say that I'm loyal to the tribe because our families were disconnected for so many years. We were brought back for a reason, and now we're moving together, towards, betterment. So my father had the opportunity to go to the United States, and he eventually did. He thought he was going to stay in Los Angeles because he fell in love with the glamour. He lands and he's surrounded by just beautiful people, but he had a job waiting in Connecticut. And he gets to Connecticut. He starts doing his thing, eventually meets my mother, and my mother and my father hit it off right away. The big joke is that my late mother, she pawned off my grandmother's cooking as her own. And was like, oh, I made you this cake, But my father fell in love, and next thing you know, has my older sister Sherry, my sister Wendy, and then I come along. And my mother and my father, they were coworkers, and that my mother was the office manager, and they were husband and wife, and they worked together and lived together for 58 years. 54 years, 54.
Incredible.
And it was just an incredible experience seeing those two interact at a young age. Like I would come home from elementary school. I'd be working on something and I'd watch my dad, my mom get off work, and we had home and office. So I would often walk through the office as my dad is, talking to patients, and a lot of family friends were patients, and to see them get off of work and be right back into a loving relationship after being professional together, but also the family medical practice. It was so awesome to see.
That's fantastic. That's such a great story. Again, like, I didn't know all about your dad that way, like how he grew up. How old was he when he was in the jungle? 7 or something?
Oh
Like he was
gosh,
a
no,
kid.
no, no. He was about 3 years old to about 6.
Oh man. So he was like
Yeah,
a toddler. Oh
very,
man.
very
Okay.
young,
So
very
incredibly young.
young.
Because
And
I got
my
that's
mhm.
yeah. Wow. I'm
and my
sorry.
my my uncles David and Vincent, they're the ones that
Mhm.
did a lot of the heavy lifting. But my dad
Mm.
watched them, and then a lot of what they did in the jungle during the war is what they did after the war to put food on a table. Like, to the point where my dad would go out as a kid with a bolo and with an air rifle
Mm.
and shoot birds, and that's what they would eat. Like that was
That's
life in the Philippines.
And that's so cool because, like, I think again, a big part of this podcast is like kind of reawakening that grit in Pinoys, right? That grit in
Mhm.
our bloodline. And I think your dad is such a great example, and his family is such a great example of that grit that we've kind of lost. And so just hearing that story is so inspiring. And speaking about your dad, and again, thank you for sharing his history with Tuon
Yeah.
and the Sayoc family. That's such a small world. I mean, that's amazing. I did want to talk about your father's, again, his influence on you, going back to that.
Yes.
What is your first memory that you have learning something from your father, realizing this is my hero? Like, I
So,
want
I
to know
mean,
about that. Yeah.
I have so many memories, and like when you try to think back to like what is your earliest childhood memory, like there's confabulation that happens where sometimes you see a
Mm,
photo and you say like, oh, I remember that, but there's no way that your child mind could process a memory at that age. So I try to think back to the earliest memory. It's difficult because we have a lot of family photos of us all piling into the car and driving down to the beach and hanging out at the beach, or hanging out in the backyard with my toy cars. And I remember little things like I remember riding my bike off of the backyard stairs and just
yeah.
totally eating it, to the point where my dad
Oh,
was like, my son hurt himself with this bike, damn this bike. And he picked it up and he broke the bike on the ground. But I just remember like things like that. Like, my father was so protective. And I
mm,
think that protective nature of my dad, I mean, to the point where even today, right? He lives with my sister today. He still checks every door every night. He still looks under beds. He looks in closets because that's a remnant of the war. I'll never forget him being protective. I'll never forget him saying when we went hiking, the first thing you do is you grab a stick. And I'm like, you grab a stick, Dad? He's like, yeah, in case you have to hit someone with it. I'm like, I'm 5 years old, Dad, or I'm 6 years old. Stick.
yeah.
He goes, or if there's a dog or if you need to reach something, you got a stick. And I'm like, okay. But
Right.
there are so many memories of him, fond memories of him, like
Mm,
where, I mean, just those sketches that he would do, on a legal pad. He would draw like what a pellet looks like versus a BB, or he would draw, like what he wanted the house to look like when he would put a renovation on. Like, watching him draw, watching him be creative, that was something that was so inspiring at a young age. And it never really hit me until I was much older that my dad was a healer. That my dad
mm,
was able to help so many people and save lives and take away pain, but not
mm,
through the typical ways that you would imagine. So many doctors get like stigmatized for doing, like, oh, here's a pill or whatever. Like, my dad would just
mm,
say, why don't you go over there and just like go breathe, drink some warm water, relax. Like, why don't you take your wife on vacation? And people fell in love with my dad because he was holistic. He
mm.
was he had access to all these prescriptions that you could give. But my dad was one to believe in, like, you need to spend time with family. You need to pray. You need to be thankful. You need to appreciate little things. And I think now that's what sticks with me the most. Like, because I can't figure out one memory. I can't think of my earliest memory, but I think just the way that my dad spoke to people and had that bedside manner, that I think is where I really was like, this guy's my hero.
That's amazing. That's really cool. And again, that's like just hearing about your father. It's so rare Because your dad is so unique in that, and there's so many I think a lot of Filipino men have a bad rap of, especially the older generation. There's a lot of negativity that's kind of associated with them, but your dad seems like this amazing pillar of masculinity and virtue and love, and again that masculine protective nature. So it's really amazing to hear that. And so, speaking of that, I want to know how your Filipino culture, because I know you grew up in a mixed culture household. How did that affect your image of Filipino culture? How did it tie you into the Filipino culture? What are some memories that you can talk about there?
Yeah. So, typical Filipino, I mean, blades are in our blood. And
Yeah.
I just remember, I mean, I grew up in the prime time. If ever you were going to get a kid to fantasize about knives, I grew up with Crocodile
Yeah.
Dundee. I grew up with Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom, where he's got the big old Kyber Bowie. I grew up with Rambo, Commando. And I mean, as a little kid, when you tell your parents, like, Mom, I want a survival knife, right? Like, they're like, what? But I remember being very young, and I remember receiving my first knockoff Swiss Army knife. And I remember my dad taught me a lot of lessons about knives, to the point where he would say, at night, we hide our knives. We don't leave them out in the kitchen. To the point where my dad would say, like, in the Philippines, when someone's handling a knife in front of you, you make sure that you've got distance from it. Like, even though my dad wasn't or isn't a practitioner of any Kali, he definitely understood martial arts. He definitely understood combatives and fighting. He would always say, like, I'm going to hit someone with the open part of my hand so I don't break my fit. Like, he would say things like that. But that was always taught to us at a very young age. Like, he was always protective. And again, growing up in the 80s, my dad would take me in the car like I was his little man. That's what he would call me, my little man. So we would go, and, like, let's say that my dad wanted to get a pair of socks or something from, like, Kmart or Calvor or Bradley, and I'm kind of naming off some chain stores.
Old school. Yeah.
So I'd be sitting in the back of the vehicle, and I'd be playing with GI Joes or He-Man or whatever, and my dad would say, like, okay, I'm just gonna run in, grab my socks, I'll be out, and if anything happens, just honk the horn. Now, that was 1980s. I mean, my dad would probably be arrested today if he left a kid unattended. But that was normal back then.
Right.
And my dad was just like, look, if we go hiking and we get lost, we're going to burn this forest down and we'll be rescued. Like, he was very, very creative with the solutions. Grab that stick. We would go to, like, a hotel, and he was always careful to, like, close blinds everywhere we went. Like, it was just that Filipino protector mentality. I won't say it was paranoid, because he experienced it, and he experienced what it felt like to have to leave in the middle of the night, or to not have a place to go home to, and you have to be secure. So that security mindset was one that was taught at a very young age. I mean, I knew what lumpia were. I knew what pancit was. I understood, tining cling. And we had, like, every Filipino family, we had the tining cling up on the wall, or the fork and the spoon, like, we had all those things.
There you go. Yeah.
But I mean, it was also offset by my Polish side, and my grandmother was the matriarch of the family, and she lived right across the yard. So I had galumkis and pierogies and I mean, you name it. And I mean, we had so much Polish culture as much as Filipino. But at the end of the day, my dad would always say, he's like, son, he's like, you are, an American. Yes, you are Filipino and Polish, but you're American. And over the years, I started saying, because it's the truth, if it weren't for that American flag, if it weren't for the men and women who serve this nation, then my Polish relatives would be speaking German, my Filipino relatives would be speaking Japanese. So even though we had that Filipino culture, and I knew what it was, and anytime that there was, like, a Miss Universe contest, and it's like Miss Philippines, my dad would be like, anytime the Philippines would be mentioned in the news with, like, Marcos or whoever it was, my dad would cheer up. But we were raised with that as an underlying element of our family, but we were always American.
100%. And that's really cool because again, like I think that's really cool to hear that you grew up in that truly mixed culture household, like really experiencing both cultures, but again, under that umbrella of being American. He's really enforcing that. And speaking of that, I want to kind of talk about something a little that kind of connected to your history
Yes.
as a professional, and it's your teaching. And when I met you, you were like you mentioned, you were a survival instructor, but you're also a full time, I think it was history teacher. Was it? Was it
Yes.
history or yeah? And so I kind of want to talk about that because how did that develop? How did your father influence you to do that? Was that something that was inspired by him or something that you kind of came across yourself?
So that's one of my favorite questions that I get asked because people are like, history teacher? No, like, what are you really? And that was always the statement. I'm like, look, I'm just a history teacher, right? Because keep in mind, like, I enjoy shooting. I enjoy, doing all the crazy winter camping, if you want to call it that. Like, and people would say, but you're a history teacher. Like, no, what do you really do? And I'm like, no, I'm not Jason Bourne. I'm not someone cool. I just enjoy doing stuff like that. So,
Yeah, yeah.
so my father at a young age, I mean, I watched him be a physician, and my dad was like, listen, being a physician today is very different than what it was when he started. I mean, toward the end of his career, I watched him take in patients for free because he knew that they needed help. There was always the insurance, 600-pound gorilla in the room that wouldn't cover certain people, but they loved my dad. And my dad's like, I'm not going to stop seeing them. So he would bring them in. And like, my dad would sometimes be only able to bill and then receive a fraction of what he could have been making. So, I mean, he sits with someone for an hour and makes $20 as a physician. My dad was like, it's not the job it used to be. So he never pushed my two older sisters or me toward becoming a physician. He said, if anything, pharmacist. He's like, you have regular hours. You don't have to wake up in the middle of the night. But like, medicine wasn't my thing. I went to a mock medical dental school thing in high school, and I enjoyed it. It's very interesting, but it was never my thing. So in college, I went to Fairfield University. And in college, I was like, okay, well, what do I want to do? And I went in undecided. And for a while, I was an English major. I was like, I don't know if I want to be a full-time English major. So I was like, there's got to be something that blends a little bit of politics and a little bit of history. So I looked at the course catalog and I found American Studies. And I loved studying about the United States. I love this nation. So I became an American Studies major with minors in politics and legal studies. And my anticipation was, I am going to go to law school. I was like, I can appreciate the law. I want to study the law. My sister was a lawyer at that time. So it's like, makes sense. So my senior year, there was the terror attack in New York, Pennsylvania, and DC called 9/11. And the interesting thing was that there was supposed to be a law school seminar at the Windows of the World restaurant in the Twin Towers that following Saturday. So in that moment, now keep in mind, I'm in Fairfield, Connecticut. We can look from the beach at New York City and see the smoke plumes at night. It was traumatic. I mean, I recall being on the beach, hearing my fellow students that lived down there crying because they knew someone in the towers or they couldn't find someone. And I remember everything being jammed up, the phone lines. I gave blood for the first time on 9/11. Like, I remember 9/11 changing my life because I had gone and taken like an LSAT practice seminar, like a session the summer before, and I was ready to take the LSATs. I bombed the LSATs because I couldn't get my head right. I was like, are we going to get drafted? Are we in a new war? I mean, like, what's happening? So my plan for law school got sidelined. I graduate that year and I'm like, what am I going to do? Well, my oldest sister had just started her master's degree at Trinity College, which was about 25 minutes away from where I grew up. And I was like, well, I'll take a master's program as well. That'll be my way of delaying, because there was part of me that said, well, maybe I don't want to interpret the law. I want to enforce it. And I thought about joining like the DEA or the ATF or the FBI, but there was the family element where I would be possibly located or dislocated from my family. And I was like, I can't have that. So then part of me was like, well, maybe I'll do local law enforcement. And the comical side of this story is I was like, well, let's see what the police running standard is. So this is right after my senior year. I'm like 230 pounds, like the heaviest I've ever been. I get on the track, I try running, and I'm like, I can't run. Like I've got to lose some weight. So then I'm like, all right, I'll do this master's program. I start the master's program. And along the way, I was like, well, working at Eastern Mountain Sports, making a little money on the side, but I need a better way of studying and still getting paid. And my older sister was like, why don't you become a substitute teacher? So I became a substitute teacher. I'm like, okay, this is easy. I sit down in the classroom and I can read my books and I can do my work. I'm basically babysitting. The first class they put me in is a first grade class at Southside Elementary. I felt like Arnold Schwarzenegger in kindergarten. I was like, kids are running everywhere. Like I wanted to be like, shut up, you know. And at the end of the day, these kids hand me like all these thank you notes. And they're like, oh, we love you. Thank you for sitting in our class. Like super, super polite. And I'm like, I'll give it another shot. And I go into the high school and I'm like, all right, these kids are actually listening to what I'm saying. And like, well, maybe I should be a teacher. Let me just try it. So I looked to see what's required of a teacher. And there's this thing called a praxis test. It's like the content level test that you have to take. So I just go and take the exit exam. And I'm like, if I can pass this thing, maybe I should be a teacher. So I take the exit exam and I not only pass it, but I pass it like 2 points shy of like distinction level. And I'm like, I didn't even study for this thing, but I guess I know history. So then I'm like, all right, I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to be a teacher. And what happened was I get my master's degree. I'm now published in this Hartford Studies project, like with student papers. I received distinction on my thesis. Like I'm legit. And I passed the exit exam. Well, I didn't pass the entrance exam. And I was never a math student. I will never claim to be good at math. And that way I'm the atypical Asian. And what happens is I am sweating bullets when I have to take this math exam, which is like sophomore level math. So I take the entrance exam. I ended up passing that, luckily. Like, okay, I'm ready to teach. Well, I never did the pedagogy classes or student teaching. So I end up getting like a long-term subbing job. I'm thinking like, okay, this is it. I'm good. And then it turns out that I lose my job because they have to replace me with a certified teacher. And I'm told, Kevin, you're a good teacher. You're not highly qualified though. I said, oh my gosh, I have a master's. I could teach at a college if I wanted to. They're like, not in the eyes of the state of Connecticut. So I had to go back, get another degree, intern along the way. And eventually I got certified to teach. And then in April of 2006, that's when I started applying. And I took the job at Bristol Central High School, where I taught for 14 years. But it was a kick in the pants to hear someone say, you're not qualified. And it would be very easy for someone to just be like, I'm throwing in the towel. But I knew that was the path. I knew that I was going to become a teacher. And luckily, I had great support from my family to say, go after that. You got it. And I did. And that led to a great job for 14 years.
Yeah. And I got to say, when I first saw you, it was, if I remember correctly, I want to say it was 2012 when I first met you. Yeah. I saw you at Sayoc Kali in Florida, and you were doing a demonstration about using paracord to break through glass, I think, or something, or sawing. It was like a rope saw or something like that.
Yeah.
And I remember watching you, and I was so young that I was like, this is probably the most articulate, like well-studied individual I've ever seen teach. Like I was so enamored with your teaching style. And to this day, when I teach people, whether it be martial arts or anything else, I try to emulate you because of your cadence and your articulation and the way you're able to describe the nitty-gritty in every single detail. And so did you feel that was always just an innate ability within you? Because I see it when you're teaching like on your survival videos for Fieldcraft, but your teaching background, did you find that it kind of lent to that innate, or did you have to develop that over time? Or is this something that's natural to you?
I'll tell you, well, number one, thank you. And I'm going to be sure to return the compliment, because I remember watching you teach one time and I had to laugh because I brought these like tiny little action flex, and you're used to like the long ones. I'm like, here's an action flex. And you looked at me, you're like, I need a real one. And I was like, oh my God, my son said like my action flex sucks. But no, I remember seeing you at the Poconos, and I was like, this guy is moving up like he's got a great capability.
Thank you.
But to your question about like learning how to teach, I first was a kayaking instructor, kayaking and canoeing instructor, and then I was a swimming instructor, and then I became the bushcrafty camping, kayaking and canoeing guide, and then eventually that led to teaching at the survival school, and then also at the high school. But I think the way that you learn to teach is you learn to mimic. You learn to you recall your most effective teachers and you just do what they do. And in my case, I can think back to Mr. Tomlinson from Bristol Central High School. He was the most charismatic guy, a little kooky. Every once in a while, he would change the tempo with an off-color comment. You're like, but he was doing that to gauge to see if people were paying attention. And I do the same thing. And I can say, I am part Mr. Tomlinson. And then I remember Dr. Orman in college. Dr. Orman was the guy who would show up and he would, off the top of his head, explain all the presidents from 1948 to the present day, telling you all the little nuances. And then next thing you know, you'd see him in the recplex shooting free throws with people and playing basketball. You're like, Mr. Tom or Dr. Orman. Wow, like that guy was all around, but he was so well versed, and he let the history, the subject, be the star. And then I think back to the cooperating teachers that I had. I had Sal Coppola, I had Nancy Nevins, I had Bob Crispino, and I had Joe Morgan. And I say I became those four teachers. So you look at the teachers that made an impact in your life and you do what they did. So I think the way that I've learned to teach people well is I let the skill set be the star of the show. And I'm just like the MC to be like, check this out. How awesome is this? As opposed to being the guy that's like, I'm going to tell you about this because I know this. You do that and it becomes instructor or teacher centered instead of lesson centered or student centered. And looking at Sayoc with feeder, receiver, and observer, right? We have that three-prong approach. Well, you can easily say like, all right, who do you want to be the feeder? Well, the teacher can be the feeder, but the feeder can also be the wrong type of feeder. If you do it right, the lesson becomes the feeder, where the lesson is like the star of the show, and the students are watching that. Like, how cool is that? And I'm just standing off to the side as like a fellow student, because I always tell the students, like, this is a collaborative effort. I learn just as much from the students as I do from the lesson, but I want the lesson to be the star. I want the lesson to be the focus. So whenever I teach survival stuff, it's like, this is something that you can do. And it's never watch what I can do. Look how cool I am. It's like, I'm going to show you a skill set that will make you better. And look at the skill, look at the skill, look at the skill, or look at this piece of gear, look at this piece of gear. And I think that's so important. Of course, there will always be times to demonstrate and let students see you do what they're trying to do. But if you only demo to show off like a skill set for self-serving purposes, then you're not really trying to be a teacher. You're trying to be a star, and I think it's important to do the demo, let them see what it's like, but then show them and then let them become the stars.
100%. Okay, that's really brilliant. I think I'm going to play that back when we put this on YouTube, and I'm just going to, because as a teacher, I'm really like taking notes. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so like just keeping the lesson at the forefront, and we're just presenting it. I never thought of it that way. I think that's incredible.
You know what that is? That's that Sayoc filter, and I swear, and this is why I will always be loyal to the system, and I will never say a bad thing about it, because that Sayoc filter of understanding the world through the basics, right? Force, timing, and space, right? The feeder, receiver, observer, and understanding just Sayoc math, right? Like, I'm not good with traditional math, but I'm good at Sayoc.
Yeah.
Understanding to be able to see the world through that filter has been such a valuable gift, because it's given me so many opportunities that I think others have passed by, because it's a superpower, and I swear by it. So when I look at the lesson and I'm like, well, where's the energy in the room, right? Sayoc is so good at tracking energy. It's like, if you can make the lesson be the energy, if you can make the content of the lesson be the energy, then the students are going to be drawn to it. Every once in a while, you just check in with them, but let that thing take over. And that's really the secret to success of teaching.
Powerful, powerful. Thank you so much for that. Speaking of Sayoc, I actually want to ask this because I was wondering when I first saw you at Sama Sama,
Mhm.
and seeing everything that your videos and stuff like that. How did your role as kind of like the survival instructor in Sayoc kind of come about? Because I remember you presenting all the time. In fact, I remember one of the times I met you, you were at Tuan Carl's house on the mountain, and you were teaching
Yes.
a course there as well, right, on a Friday. And I saw you there. And I think that I was actually telling you I'm gonna be a teacher. Do you have any advice? I remember that I asked you advice on that day regarding teaching. But how did that role kind of come about within the tribe? I was always been curious about that. Like, how did
Okay.
you become that guy?
So when I joined SIAC, it was
Mm-hmm.
in September of 2007. So I was, you know, so interested in learning Filipino martial arts. And obviously, like, there's no secrets in SIAC. Everyone knows what everyone does. We always say it's a tribe of masters. And there are a lot of SMEs, medical professionals, finance guys, attorneys, Hollywood guys, and now me, right? A survival guy. And granted, there are other people in the tribe who I've taught, other people in the tribe I've learned from, very talented in the wilderness. But I was always the one that was brought in as like the survival guy. Well, the fun thing is I waited a year and a half to go to my first Sama Sama. And at Sama Sama, I heard all these things about it, which for those of you who are listening that might not know about it, it's our annual instructor ranking weekend. It's where we do our testing. It's the gathering. It's a family gathering. So I'm told it's down in the Poconos, and I love the Poconos. So I was like, I'm just going to camp when I'm down there. Well, I decide that I'm going to camp down there, and I do. And I'm setting up my camp, and I'm looking for firewood and whatnot. And next thing you know, I see paintballs flying past me. I'm like, what the heck was that? And I see guys that are like all kitted out, and they're going, and they knew that I wasn't in play, but they're like shooting at other people. And I'm like, what is going on? So I just continue doing my thing. I'm camping out, and Manatuhan is watching. And at one point he walks by, and I made like a tripod to hang like some stuff on and whatnot. And he's like, oh, he's kind of like taking interest. And then eventually I was asked to help out with like the Sayao and build the fire. And, they're like, okay, well, why don't you, the first lesson that I taught was a nighttime navigation lesson where I'm explaining like when you travel at night, sound tends to travel further, things quiet down at night. You can use celestial navigation, da, 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 da. And then I got a lesson from Guru John Parings, and he's like, hey, you should take a head count before you start. Take a head count afterwards. And like, good lessons, good talking points. But that was them feeling me out. And shortly after that, I was asked to do the hidden agenda. And the hidden agenda, I remember I was fishing at Pulaski River in upstate New York or Western New York. And I got the message, hey, we want you to teach hidden agenda. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is the seminar that's prior to the main event. And it was primitive projectiles. So I did this whole research on like the atlatl, staff sling, and the boleadora and whatnot. And actually, to back everything up, the first thing I did that kind of showed the tribe what I knew, we had to hang banners. And I watched a couple knots get tied on a string, and it slid. And I'm like, I got a better knot. And I think I tied like a taut line hitch or maybe a prusik or something. And the next, people are like, that guy knows knots. Like they were tracking the knowledge. Yeah. And it just became like one little test after another. And then eventually those hidden agendas in the United States became, hey, we want you to teach at the UK Sama Sama. So now I've got to plan, like, how do I plan all the logistics of flying with equipment, getting over there and this and that. So it was really interesting to be challenged, to be tested by the tribe. And just one thing led to another. And, when I eventually made it to that call of the mountain, Tuan Carl was like, hey, we want you to do, a primitive weapons thing. And then next, I'm learning from, the AK guys as well. And like that connection was through little deeds, and in SIAC, we always say that loyalty is chain of unbroken deeds. So it's like little things. Hey, can you do this? Yep. Hey, can you do that? And eventually, it got to the point where I'm down in Florida early. Okay. This is now 2011, 2012. I'm down in Florida early, and I'm sitting at Manatuhan's island in his kitchen. And he goes, hey, when's your book coming out? And I was like, this is actually 2012. I remember this now, 2012. And he goes, I'm like, oh, I'm not writing a book. I'm writing magazine art. It's like, no, you're ready. It's like, you're ready. And I'll never forget him saying that I was ready. And that's really what kind of put that in my head to do that. So my involvement with the tribe came through these little challenges and accepting these challenges and being willing to accept the pressure, knowing that everything was done for a purpose. I don't think I would be as organized as I am today with planning events for the current company I'm in or my own personal projects if it weren't for being forced, right, to do everything correctly because you don't want to disappoint the tribe when you have to fly overseas and teach, a seminar to a bunch of foreigners that don't speak your language, but they understand form language. They understand, movement. And it was very, very interesting. It made me a better person to be tested. And I feel like people are unwilling today to accept those challenges, but you learn so much. And you hear it all the time in training. You either win or you learn. There's no failure in training because it's something educational. And I always consider that training so invaluable. Whether it was tying simple knots or putting a survival seminar or teaching a guy for a week of private class all on my own, it was all designed to make me grow and help me level up.
That's great to hear. And so I see you truly as this wonderful product, this strong product of masculine Filipino men in your life. Like you have your dad, you have Pamana Tuhan, you have everyone in the tribe. So how has that informed your, I guess, not just your teaching style, but your leadership style? You said you're the director of training and Fieldcraft. So how does that impact you in your life, both professionally and personally, those leadership lessons from Pamana Tuhan, Chris Sayoc, as well as your father?
So I would say that you are what you repeatedly do. That's an expression that I've always lived by. And I think about the people who I surround myself with. And I always want to act in a way that would make those people proud. I would never want to do something where it would reflect negatively upon me. And having discussions with men like Tuan Harley and Tuan Tom Kyer, it's very interesting to talk about the concept of honor and loyalty. And it's lost today in terms of leadership. I've been doing a lot of leadership posts on social media, and they've been received extremely well because I feel like there's a vacuum of understanding what leadership is. And having good leaders around me has made me be a better leader for my subordinates, or made me a better leader in terms of promoting ideas for society, like readiness concept. So I think it's important to think about, how did those people lead? Well, number one, they all led by example, right? My dad leads by example to this day. Pamana Tuhan led by example. He left behind a legacy of leaders that I draw inspiration from. And I look at the values that matter, right? Like, we're not just that role that we're in. Like, I'm not just the survival guy. At the end of the day, when I, clock out for the day, I still carry my last name. And respect is something that transcends your 9 to 5 into every action of your day. And it starts with respecting yourself in the morning. So, I could speak about the various virtues, but let's talk about that simple respect. When you wake up in the morning, do you hit snooze? If you hit snooze, do you respect the day? Do you respect the time that you have to get things done? Do you respect yourself in terms of the diet that you eat? Do you respect yourself with the company that you keep? Because they're reflective of you. So I look at all of these elements of how these formative people in my life carried themselves or carry themselves. And I say, am I in line with them? Am I lockstep with them? And if I were to meet my father at my age and at his age, if we were at the same age, would we be peers? And not just peers, like maybe not necessarily like business, but like with our values. Was my dad at 43 the same as I am? My goal is I want to be at least where he is at 85 when I'm 85, and I'm sure my father would say he wants me to be better. So it's like, you always have to remember that concept of respect, because respect is always tied to honor. Right. And I look at it like, we like using that word respect, right? There's songs about respect, right? RESPECT. But there aren't songs about honor. And honor is a stronger word, but we understand that term respect. And I would say that my actions are done to respect myself and others, but ultimately honor. And I want to bring honor to anything that I do. And Sayoc has taught me that we have to be strong with our words. We can't say, well, he's somewhat honorable. It's either you are honorable or you are not. Do not give yourself the easy way out by saying, sometimes I'm honorable. It's like, are you an honorable person? And I think that is the singular driving force in how I treat people, how I act. It's like, am I doing something to honor the company I work for, to honor myself, to honor my family, my loved ones, and so forth? Honor means everything.
That was awesome. I want my sons to hear that for sure. That was very inspiring. Thank you so much for that. And so I want to talk about, speaking of your background and all that stuff, your professional background, as we kind of wind down, survival preparedness. I know that's an essential part of being a man. Your father, you speak of your father being very protective, understanding how to navigate through the woods, growing up in the jungle. Right now the world's crazy, right? Like, we're looking at the world right now. I'm in Texas, everything going on at the border. I hopefully the next time you come to Texas, you don't need a passport to come see me, or you know what I mean?
That's
like,
right.
We'll see what happens, right? It's getting crazy there. Everything's so uncertain these days. And I think since the pandemic, people have realized how fragile society really can be. I really wanted to know, for the average guy listening to this, a guy living in the suburbs, maybe like myself, maybe married, has kids, is trying to get into that. Where do you think they should start, and what are kind of like the fundamentals that they should have? Because I know you have so much information on this, but I know there's people listening to this who don't know those things, those survival things. What could you share for the average guy?
I would say that it's a marathon, not a sprint. I would say that it can be extremely overwhelming. The old joke is, how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time, instead of trying to eat it all at once. And the whole thing with survival and preparedness is that it's conceptual. And we have to remember that concept of security. And whether that security is financial security, or that security is physical security, or security for families, security is security. And then from there, it's like, okay, then we have to worry about shelter, worry about keeping blood in the body. And all these various needs are always in flux. So we have to have the capability of treating people. We have to have the capability to shelter people. And we have to have the capability to provide food and drink. All of those are conceptual. So for a person living in the suburb who may be a couple states away from a wilderness environment where they don't leave the concrete jungle, then they should be at least prepared to go from where they live to where they work and be able to find shelter, even if it means swiping a credit card, getting a room for the night. But if we're talking strictly speaking, like with wilderness stuff, it's as simple as starting off with one element. Start with one element of that elephant that you're trying to eat the entire thing of. Throw a Swiss Army knife in your pocket. Get a good Swiss Army knife that has a few functions. And remember that you have it when one of those functions is needed, because that creates a sense of belonging. It creates a sense of dependence where someone's like, man, I needed you here. You were here. You had what I needed. And that should, as a man, make you feel good. Right? Because it's better to be part of a solution than part of a problem. You carry a flashlight after that Swiss Army knife, and it's like, wow, now you have the ability to see in the dark when other people are using their phones. And you're probably going to carry a better flashlight than their phone is capable of being. So now it's like you're becoming a capable individual, which others should look up to. I know there are things I can't do around my house. And when my buddies come over and they help me out, I'm like, thank you. Like I look up to my friend for doing that. I think it's so important that we strive for capability. We strive for having the tools, which is the easiest thing in the world to impart upon people, is just carry a few tools and watch how useful you become if you know how to use them. And then eventually you start realizing, wow, those tools get more sophisticated where, maybe your tool is that flashlight and you can see in the dark. Maybe your tool is the first aid kit and you can treat people. But then eventually you start saying like, okay, what is both possible and probable? And you're carrying the right tools to address realistic needs. And people are like, man, I'm glad that person's there. And if as a human being, you do not get that little like warm and fuzzy feeling that people appreciate you for being someone that they need, I mean, I don't think you're a human being if it doesn't inspire you to want to do more. So I think when you get that taste of what that is, it'll make you say, well, all right, I understand grappling, but that's not the only way people fight. So I'm going to learn how to strike. And then you say, well, there's a person over there I want to hit, but I can't grapple with them or punch them from here. And they're trying to shoot me. Maybe I should shoot back. Right.
Yeah.
Then you want to do that. And then you're like, okay, I know how to apply bandages correctly. But there's this other thing that happens to people like broken fingers. Well, I know now how to splint. Like it becomes an insatiable appetite for knowledge. And as long as that knowledge is driven to the end goal of you being an asset for your community, your tribe, your family, your neighborhood, the business that you're in. I mean, it becomes like a perpetual motion machine where it's like it never ever stops until the day you die. You're always looking for knowledge.
Awesome. That's really cool. Yeah, like just having those little gateway things of I'm gonna carry a Swiss Army knife, I'm gonna have a blade, I'm gonna have a pistol. Like that rings true for me because I started out in like a martial arts dojo and I'm like, well, how far can I take this? And like, oh, wait a minute. I know how to fight. I have all these great skills, but guess what? I don't know how to start a fire in case I'm stuck in the woods. Like again, it comes down to protection in all aspects, which I love. And so I respect your time. We are winding down and I want to ask you this question. I always try to end these podcast interviews because I could go on for hours with you. I think everything you're saying is so powerful and so interesting, but I really want to see like how it would impact my boys, especially like, so the question I would give you, imagine my boys are of age. I got a 7-year-old, I got a 2-year-old, I got a 9-month-old. They're a little young right now, so they probably wouldn't understand everything we're talking about, but they're behind me and I give you the floor for 10 minutes and they ask you, what does it mean to be a man? What advice could you give my sons as to what it means to be a man from your experience, from your mentorship, from other mentors? What would you tell them?
I would ask them questions, right? Because I think knowledge lies in the questions you ask. It's not the statements you make. So I would say, does turning 18 make you a man? And hopefully they would come to the conclusion that by law, I'm no longer an adolescent. I'm a man at 18. Okay. Does turning 18 make you a gentleman? Because a gentleman is different than a man. A gentleman is cultured. Gentleman is well-versed in the ways of the world and is skilled. I would say, well, if you're a gentleman, are you also a Renaissance man? And I would ask them questions that just keep getting them to think about what it means to be a man. And I would say, well, what's a Renaissance man? They hopefully would say someone who is knowledgeable in the arts, someone who is capable in so many ways, whether that's cooking and painting and being imaginative. I would say things like, okay, well, is being a man enough? And hopefully they would come to the conclusion like, well, dad has mommy, and they would find out that being a man is only part of the equation. It's meaningless if you don't have the right woman with you. But not just that, you should be, part of a bigger picture, because I wouldn't want your boys to think it's only about them. I would say to them, who are the greatest men you can think of in history? And then have them think about why those men were the greatest men that were the ones that they remember. Was it for something that they did? Was it something for what they said? Is it something that they left the world with? And hopefully they start thinking how their actions will have reverberations beyond their lifetime, right? Which I think is a goal of manhood, is to leave the world better than the way that you found it as a boy. So I think at that point, I would say, well, what would a man not do? And hopefully they would say things like, a man would not disrespect his woman. A man would not, do something that society would look down upon. And they could start figuring out what the left and the right limits of becoming a man is. And then I think the last question that I would ask them is something along the lines of, what kind of man will you become? Because I'd want to plant that seed after giving them all these ideas. And I'd want to know what they would want to become, because at some point, in the same way that my dad showed me those drawings as a little kid, a couple sketches that got implanted in my head as a little kid became a career that I've lived, where I have a best-selling book. I'm teaching on an international level. I have people messaging me saying I've changed their life. So I would want to impart them with that seed that they will then take from that conversation and from remembering those questions that I asked them to live a life that's worth remembering.
Again, so powerful, man. So I'm like going to play this over and over for myself. And when they're in the car, I'm going to play that speech. That was great, man. I appreciate you, brother. So again, thank you so much, Kevin, for coming on.
My pleasure.
This podcast would not have been possible without your inspiration. You inspire me with your father's interview and all the things you've spoken about him. So thank you so much for this. How can our listeners learn more about you? How can they reach you? What are some things you could share with them in regards to that?
So right now, the best way to reach me is Instagram and the platform formerly known as Twitter, now called X. It's the same handle. It's ESTELA Wild Ed, Estela Wild Ed, short for Estela Wilderness Education. My email constantly changes. I've been trying to get away from giving out one email, because next thing you know, it's going to be another one. But that would be the best way. And I'm very active on social media, so DMs do go a long way. And I do reply to every single one of them. I gave away my cell phone a long time ago on a podcast, and I regret that because I have strangers messaging me. But yeah, I think that would be the best way. And of course, I always tell people, find me around the fire. That's where a lot of the knowledge happens. I'm always training. I love teaching people. And if I'm at a trade show, don't be afraid to come up to me and be like, hey, I heard you on the podcast. Like, I will never be the person who's like, hey, I can't come in this room. My head won't fit. Like, at the end of the day, I am just another man. I'm someone who, is very proud of what I do, but I don't let it be all that I do. And it's absolutely, absolutely flattering for people to come up to me. And I'll never turn away someone who wants to have a conversation. So whether it's in person, it's online, around the fire, I'm just super happy to talk to people that want to engage in a very constructive conversation.
Well, thanks, Kevin. Actually, before I end, I want to say something, because my brother-in-law and my sister came to visit the Field Craft Survival headquarters over in Utah.
Yeah.
And it was, I don't know if you know the whole story, but basically my brother-in-law, JR, he was like, oh man, I wonder if he's here. And they didn't know whether you're going to be there or not. Like, oh, I guess he's not here. And then they met you, and they could not stop talking about how kind you are, how hospitable you were. They felt like they knew you their whole life. And I think that's a testament to who you are. And you welcome them with open arms. You show them around. I mean, my brother JR, he's listening to this right now, I'm sure. He really appreciated that. I know my sister really loves you for that. And so thank you for that. Because again, it shows who you are. You're not this influencer person on a pedestal. You really are a good older brother figure, a guy who just really wants to help out those who need help. And I can see that in this podcast. So thank you again, brother. I appreciate you, man. Thank you.
Yeah, you got it. And tell them I said hello. I won't forget that day. I remember I showed them the mural, and I was like, "Go take the picture. I'll take the photo for you." Like, yeah, they were great people. So
they're moving here now. They're moving to Texas.
Outstanding.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll all see each other again. We'll reunite down here. So yeah.